Sunny.
Okay, we're going to start our meeting today. Thank you so much for everybody for being here, and a special thanks in particular to the City of Los Angeles and its excellent city planner, Ken Bernstein, my right-hand man, literally today, who helped to arrange this room along with the full city planning department and city staff. What a privilege for all of us to be here in this absolutely magnificent building in this spectacular room. So kudos to the City of Los Angeles for investing in this place and continuing to make sure that it's a valuable public asset, including for our meeting today. I'm Sarah Bronin, the chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And I'm especially glad that we have so many people in the audience today, because this is truly an extraordinary meeting. One I hope marks a turning point in open and honest dialogue between two communities that are near and dear to my heart, the historic preservation community and the housing community. We're having this conversation deep in the heart of the country's affordable housing struggle in California, and its biggest city, Los Angeles, where we see the effects of that struggle visible on the streets, in the neighborhoods, and in the lives of people who live here. We are where we are because of a confluence of factors, some market-driven, some government-driven, some systemic racism, some mere ignorance. We could spend this whole meeting diagnosing how this happened, but I don't want to go back. I want to look forward. And so with that in mind, I want to discuss how one particular aspect of the housing debate, the housing issue, historic preservation, fits in. And I want to identify ways that historic preservationists can be leaders in this important discussion about housing. So I'll just say on a personal note that I'm an unabashed preservationist. I love old buildings. I live in an 1865 brownstone. I have worked on our statewide historic preservation nonprofit and at our local historic preservation commission. But I've also spent a lot of time in the housing community, spending time working on state and local policies that create and facilitate housing, and even been involved in building housing. With that background in mind, today I'm representing the federal government and the agency, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, that oversees federal historic preservation policy. Our federal agency, for those who haven't heard of it before, has 24 members, including 9 federal agencies, several officials and representatives of nonprofit organizations, and 8 individual presidential appointees, including myself and my fellow council member, Sunny Ward, a distinguished Los Angeles architect, chair of the Architecture Review Board in California, who is co-hosting today's meeting. So with that brief introduction, I will turn it over to Mr. Ward to make a few welcoming remarks as well.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm honored to join Chair Bronin today representing the Advisory Council and addressing the California Architects Board earlier. Appointed last year by Biden, I've seen firsthand the collaborative policy development process involving council members, tribal nations, and the public. I'm especially proud of the work on our housing and preservation policy statement. As an architect, I'm deeply committed to historic preservation. I also recognize our urgent housing crisis. California, which is home to 1 in 8.5 Americans, faces a stark challenge. Housing production over the last decade has hovered around 80,000 a year, when we need 180,000 a year. The intersection of historic preservation and housing innovation represents an opportunity. By repurposing historic structures for housing, we not only address the housing shortage, but also protect our heritage. This approach can revitalize communities and make them more vibrant and sustainable. Our goal today here is to listen, share, and inspire actions towards solving the housing crisis, balancing our rich history with the urgent need for housing. I'll now pass it back over to Chair Broden to discuss our policy in more detail. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And so before turning to our guests on our panel today, I do want to say a little bit more about the way the Advisory Council understands the issue of housing and preservation. And all of that is reflected in the policy statement that we adopted in December, which is available at achp.gov for anybody listening in on the live stream. Just to say that when the council adopts a policy statement, it's a pretty big deal. In 2023, we adopted 3 different policy statements, and the first one was on burial sites, human remains, and funerary objects. The second was on climate change and historic preservation. And the third one, adopted in December, was on housing and historic preservation. Those 3 policy statements represent a record for the agency, the largest number of policy statements adopted since the Advisory Council was created in 1966 by the National Historic Preservation Act. Once a policy is adopted, it's official federal policy, we are a federal agency, but we're also supposed to adopt it within the rules that we write for a regulatory process. That's called Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, for those who are familiar with that. We're also supposed to use the adopted policy statement voted on by members to advise the President, Congress, and state and local governments about ways we as preservationists and we as policymakers can improve the way preservation responds to the array of social issues that we face as a nation. The reason the housing policy matters, the one that we adopted in December, is that for the first time, we as an agency address all housing, not just affordable housing, and we say emphatically that historic buildings should be far, far easier to be converted to or rehabilitated as housing. As you get into the details of the statement, it includes ideas like expanding tax credit programs, changing zoning to allow denser development in historic neighborhoods, to allow accessory dwelling units and infill, to allow conversions. It also means taking a proactive approach to ensuring that preservation doesn't stand in the way of reducing environmental hazards like lead, asbestos, radon, and mold in historic buildings. The housing policy also matters because it is going to clarify that regulatory process we oversee, the Section 106 review process, which, by the way, touches 120,000 federal agency undertakings annually. Many of those undertakings do involve housing. For example, not just the housing and urban development built or funded projects, but also military housing, veterans housing, rural housing funded by the USDA, and employee housing in our national parks. We're already drafting new guidance for all of those federal housing projects, which should make it easier and simpler for federal agencies to convert their buildings to housing and to rehabilitate the housing that they already have. These big changes were supported by our members through the housing policy statement, and they continue to be supported even as we speak, as we develop this additional guidance. These changes also help us to engage with other groups, and these ideas help us to engage with other groups, including those that we are convening today. So with that, it's my pleasure to invite the panelists to introduce themselves. And I'll start with Mr. Garcia on the end and moving in this direction. Go ahead, Mr. Garcia.
Good afternoon, Chair Bronin and the rest of the panelists here. Thank you for having this conversation and for inviting me to be a part of it. So my name is David Garcia. I am the Policy Director at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. We are a housing research and policy organization that deals with really all manners of housing issues, from land use and supply to homelessness to the intersection of climate change and housing. But I'm here today to talk a little bit about our work that we have done looking at the feasibility and the potential for adaptive reuse, particularly in older structures and in office to residential conversion. So thanks again for having me.
Mr. Fine.
Thank you, Chair Bronin and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation for convening this. We appreciate that. I'm Adrian Scott Fine. I'm the President and CEO for the Los Angeles Conservancy. And for those that don't know us, we are a citywide, countywide historic preservation organization, nonprofit, both education and advocacy. And this issue of housing is something we're very much getting involved in already, and wanting to do more around this, especially around the nexus between preservation and how we can find that win-win between these two seemingly competing, but although I think we believe that they're not, or they shouldn't be, competing interest. So thank you.
Thank you. And before turning to our State Historic Preservation Officer, I just wanted to mention that the LA Conservancy is a part of the National Preservation Partners Network, which is an observer to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, one I was very glad to appoint as of January as a representative and a participant in our work. And now our State Historic Preservation Officer, Julie Polanco.
Thank you, Chair Brown. Hi, I'm Julie Polanco. I have the pleasure of being your State Historic Preservation Officer. I've held this position for the past 9 years, and prior to that, worked for a privatized housing and lodging developer in the military context, and then before that, taking the Presidio of San Francisco from military base to urban park. So had a lot of experience hands-on rehabilitating properties for housing and lodging in those two contexts. I appreciate the opportunity, Sarah. Thank you for having us today, and to have this really important conversation about how we balance the needs of communities in the ways that we are called to be doing now, and how preservation can play an active, strong partnership role in that. So I'm really looking forward to the exciting conversation we're going to have today, and thanks for having us.
Thank you. And as our senior-most historic preservation official here, we're very grateful for your time and in being here. And I should say that among our state historic preservation officers, Ms. Polanco is one, but the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, representing all 59 across the country, is a full member of the Advisory Council. And so her leadership role within that organization and leadership in this context is very helpful. Turning from the state now to the local level, Mr. Bernstein.
Yes, good afternoon. Ken Bernstein. I'm Principal City Planner with Los Angeles City Planning, and it's really a great honor to be able to welcome Chair Bronin to Los Angeles, and the ACHP welcome our State Historic Preservation Officer to Los Angeles as well. And we're very honored and proud to host you here in Los Angeles City Hall. And this could not be a more timely and pertinent conversation here in the city of Los Angeles as we prepare to step up to meet our state and regional housing obligations through a comprehensive citywide housing incentive program, and are grappling with ways to really integrate how we address the affordable housing and housing supply needs of our city while protecting the historic neighborhoods and historic places that define our city. So thank you for convening us.
Thank you. Mr. Eckhouse.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair Bronin, for bringing us all together here, and thank you to everyone joining us in the audience as well. My name is Aaron Eckhouse. I'm the Local and Regional Policy Program Director with California YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard. We're a statewide housing policy advocacy, research, and education organization, and we're working to end California's housing crisis, make our state a place where everyone can afford to live, work, and raise a family.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Phillips.
My name is Shane Phillips. I work for the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. We're a research center at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs focused on transportation equity and housing and land use issues. And I think a lot of our work lately in particular has been focused on housing affordability, but fair housing in particular. So by that, I mainly mean making sure that we're building housing of all types, particularly in higher income neighborhoods, job-rich neighborhoods, neighborhoods with a lot of amenities, many of which have been historically very exclusionary to people of color, to lower income households, even middle income households. So that's kind of the perspective I'm taking here, and I really appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Thank you. And so with that, let's just start the conversation. And I hope everybody in the audience appreciates how all of these different perspectives can hopefully inform it. And I think I'm going to start actually with just setting out some basics about the role of state and local governments in this space. And I'm going to turn first to State Historic Preservation Officer Polanco. And you've been the longest serving, I learned earlier today, SHPO is how they call it in the state of California. Can you just explain the SHPO's role in reviewing housing projects and housing conversions?
Absolutely. So we have a couple of different mandated obligations under state and federal law to review projects that have the potential to affect historic resources. And they're anything from the removal of dams on the Klamath River to the construction of highways and roads, So we are constantly looking at the value of historic preservation in the lens of the effects under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and Public Resources Code 5024 on the state side for state-owned properties. In that review, we really are looking at how we're balancing, and I would say in all of them, we're really looking at how we balance community needs and community values. And we also administer the federal historic tax credit process. It's for income generating properties. The exchange for receiving the benefit of the tax credit is that the person rehabilitating the building will rehabilitate it to a particular standard called the Secretary of the Interior Standards. So it's a trade-off. It's a public benefit for a public relief of dollars. The state is also standing up a state historic tax credit. We're hoping to be in a position to start accepting applications in the middle of this year. This one includes a residential program, which we're really excited about, and for the first time in California, we'll be able to afford or to offer tax credits to folks who are rehabilitating their homes. And then finally, we administer the registration programs for the state, the California Historical Resources, and then the National Register of Historic Places. This puts properties on the list, so makes them considered historic under these federal laws for a specific review. So what goes on those lists has ramifications and potentials for what gets reviewed in those two regulatory processes that I mentioned. But I think in all of them, we have 35 staff who are all professionally qualified in archaeology, historic architecture, architectural historians, but all of us are community members and come from a place where historic preservation plays an important role in our history, in our past, and certainly in our future. And I think that one of the things that I've tried to bring to this office in the last 9 years is the balance and the practicality of all of the community values that preservation plays a very important role in, and how can we be good partners to our sister agencies who are also administering important public benefits.
Thank you. And I'll actually turn to you, Mr. Bernstein. Like our State Historic Preservation Officer, you are a veteran public servant serving in your role since 2006, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of changes during that time. Now, she talked about the SHPO's role in public and private projects. I was hoping maybe you could focus on the City of LA's role, and cities across the state have, of course, similar frameworks. But the City of LA's role in reviewing private projects, and how do you go about that?
Well, sure, thanks. So we are part of the City Planning Department, and I think it is really important that our Office of Historic Resources is really part of the city's development review process and long-range planning process as well. Historic preservation reviews in Los Angeles are a little different from some other cities. We have a bifurcated process. We have a cultural heritage ordinance for the designation of individual landmarks, our historic cultural monuments. We have almost 1,300 of those. We actually have 3 of our cultural heritage commissioners in the room today, including our commission president, Barry Malofsky, Gail Kennard, our vice president, Richard Barron, our longest-serving commissioner, are all here with us. And we have a separate ordinance for our historic preservation overlay zones, the local historic districts in LA, and there are 35 of those, which are overseen in part by 21 volunteer boards that are kind of mini commissions as well. And we have a number of our HPOZ board members here in the room today with us as well. But in practice, most housing development review takes place more at a staff level. The HPOZ boards, by and large, are advisory to planning staff in making final determinations within the historic districts. The commission delegates significant authority to our staff to conduct day-to-day reviews of housing projects. And I do think we've been able to be successful in balancing historic preservation and reuse of historic buildings for housing opportunities, both in our HPOZs and in our historic cultural monuments, such as a project in one of our HPOZs, the Norwood Learning Village. There was a low-income housing tax credit project for 29 affordable housing units. Richard Barron, who's on our commission, designed an expansion of the Boyle Hotel in Boyle Heights, which rehabilitated, I think, about 30 units, added a compatible new addition, 21 additional units. We have a Paul R. Williams YMCA in South LA, where we approved a highly differentiated 5-story addition to adaptively reuse a community center in South LA as affordable housing, and then add on an additional 25 housing units. many other examples where we've been able to, through our regular review processes, accommodate housing opportunity and affordable housing.
Great, thank you for that background. So we've set the stage a little bit. I've talked about the federal process. We've heard about the state and local processes as well. And that's really the regulator side, the regulatory side. So I want to turn next to some of the challenges that our housing and preservation advocates are seeing on the ground. And although I said I didn't want to look back, I do want to at least highlight a few of the issues that, again, we're seeing out in the field. And I think we all recognize in this room that housing rehabs are sometimes perceived to be complicated, either because of the cost of environmental remediation or because of maybe standards that might be imposed in the design review process, or again, maybe just the perception that it's easier to build something from scratch. I'm going to turn to Mr. Scott Fine from the LA Conservancy, and just to actually ask you a question about housing conversions. So in DC, which is where our agency is based, of course, there's a lot of talk from the White House and from our federal agency partners about the need to help promote office to residential conversions and the need to commercial conversions of all kinds. We've embraced that at the Advisory Council as well. And we know that many cities are working, including LA, are working to address that issue. I was going to ask you, through your work at the LA Conservancy, what kinds of challenges and issues you've seen in conversions locally. If you have great examples to share, I think it would be worth sharing with the audience.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start by saying this is something that LA has been working on for many years in terms of this. I think we're in a new phase of talking about conversions, but just to remind everyone and those that are tuning in maybe from other places that LA passed the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance in 1999. That really has been the model nationally in terms of how to incentivize that type of conversion. And many of those buildings were originally office buildings. A lot of them were sitting empty for many years, if not decades, before they were converted for housing. And I think that created somewhere between 12 to 14,000 new housing units, predominantly in the downtown. And we've seen that across the city. And I'm sure Ken will talk later about a new plan to adapt the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance 2.0 to make it even more effective, especially around the housing issue. But in terms of the challenges, and especially some of the buildings that we're looking at now, as we're still kind of coming off of COVID and thinking about what buildings will be reactivated or continue as office and those that maybe need to be looking at other uses. I think that's a conversation that is happening in earnest across the city and honestly nationally in terms of how to do that. But some of the challenges, it's easier said than done, is that in some cases we have owners of these buildings that have in some cases unrealistic expectations of the value of the building, so it's hard to transfer it into the hands of somebody that actually might do a conversion. Sometimes the floor plates aren't so conducive to conversion for housing, or it makes it much more difficult. If they haven't had a seismic retrofit, that's a major cost outlay that may not make it feasible to take on that project. There's a lot of things like that around the infrastructure, and not every office building right now is certainly conducive for that. Having said that, there are a lot, and that should be looked at. The other piece to this is we've got probably a lot of people, owners, developers sitting on their buildings still waiting to see what's going to happen. How is the office market going to shake out? And that's still to be determined. But while we have a great track record of buildings, we have a lot of buildings sitting empty, especially office buildings, and we have some buildings that have been perennially empty. One I would just throw out as an example is the Crocker Bank building, which is across the street from our office at 6th and Grand. It's a 1969 really fantastic modernist building by Pereira, but it's been sitting empty, largely empty, for many, many years. In 2007, it was considered for housing. It's still sitting vacant in terms of that. I think part of the other challenge to this is how do we fill the gap in terms of incentives, financial, and I agree, some streamlining to try to make these conversions possible. The other piece I'll leave with is we are trying to be problem solvers in this issue, again, bridging with the housing community and preservation. So for the past 6 months, the LA Conservancy, the California Preservation Foundation, and through Assembly Matt Haney's office, we have been working with YIMBY Action, another YIMBY organization, to think about this specific issue about office to housing conversion and what type of legislation could perhaps be helpful in terms of trying to make that happen. Last week, a bill was introduced at the State Assembly, Bill 1532. It's not perfect. I'm sure it will be amended as the process goes, but it is looking at these issues around streamlining, finding common ground between preservation and YIMBY communities, trying to make sure there's adequate safeguards for historic buildings, and also trying to create some new incentives, financial incentives, to try to fill the gap with this. And then lastly, I would just say, Julie mentioned the state historic tax credit, which we're very happy to see that launched very soon. But it also is built in a bump up for affordable housing projects that get a slightly increased tax credit. So it's trying to think more creatively about how do we make these things happen, and again, trying to be for things in terms of that confluence between preservation and housing.
Thank you for those examples. And in light of the financial issues that you mentioned, I'm going to turn to Mr. Garcia and then want to hear from Mr. Eckhouse and ask you, in some senses, it is a numbers game. So at the Turner Center, I know you've studied some ways that we might reposition underutilized assets. How do these projects pencil out? What have you learned from your research? And are you seeing the same things that Mr. Scott Fine is seeing?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what we just heard, in that it is a challenging environment right now to build new housing in general. And then you layer the complexities of an adaptive reuse project on top of that, and it's very hard to see a large number of these projects moving forward. That being said, we clearly have an opportunity here to reposition a lot of these buildings and for the purpose of creating new housing supply, and at the same time preserving historic buildings. And so for me, it does come down to this incentive-based approach that a lot of other cities and states have taken outside of California. The example that I like to point to, I have a couple examples, but one is the city of Calgary in Canada, a different country for sure, but was actually suffering from high office vacancy rates because of their oil boom and bust cycles there before the pandemic. And so part of the approach in Calgary was to create an incentive program that essentially reimbursed office conversions for up to $75 per square foot to jumpstart their market there. So in just 2 years since the program was implemented, 17 buildings have been proposed to be converted from office to residential. And so in conversations with developers who are examining these processes, it's not very different than conversations with ground up new construction developers. The numbers really just don't work right now in this market because of a combination of high interest rates, high construction costs, and in many cases revenues that would not fill the gap of that cost. And so when we think about adaptive reuse, particularly for historic buildings to residential, I think we need to think about different ways to fill that gap that can help move these projects forward. Another example has been tax abatement programs. So the state of New York has done this. The New York Times did a really interesting piece on the city of Cleveland recently that looked at how they used abatement programs and tax increment financing to create a financing structure to make these conversions work better in these places. So obviously every city, every state has a unique structure and markets, but I do think we need to kind of pull out all the tools in the toolbox if we agree that it's important that we both preserve existing buildings, repurpose them to their highest and best use, and add housing supply, which in my mind are all kind of critically important and should be complementary.
And just on the filling the gap question, I don't know if you guys have isolated the historic preservation tax credit that's given at the federal level, and if you have, if you've observed anything on that point, and if not, just to say that, I'll let you answer and then I'll
Sure. No, that's a great point. So the federal historic tax credit, I think, is a great potential source for gap financing for some of these projects. My understanding is that it's not always the easiest to use because to qualify for the tax credit, you oftentimes have to adhere to specific standards from the Secretary of the Interior's office, and that can add extra cost. And a lot of times developers, particularly on the private side, are not used to working with tax credits, they're not used to syndication, and so they oftentimes won't consider that as an option. That being said, I do think there should be some thinking on is there a way to reconsider how the tax credit is administered, or how developers view the credit so that it can be leveraged more widely?
Thank you for that. And the reason I ask is because the historic tax credit, as I mentioned, is part of our housing and historic preservation policy statement. In fact, I think it's the first item on the list because of how successful it has been and could be if improved from a technical standpoint. And a couple of the things that we have heard as a council over the years include that it's difficult to use with low-income housing tax credits, new markets tax credits, and renewable tax credits. So all of these, especially the low-income and new markets tax credits, which focus on places where you might call them underserved communities, certainly an under-fulfilled need for low-income and subsidized housing. Of course, if we can harmonize those better, that's certainly a goal of ours. As an independent agency, we can take positions like that and advocate or present them to Congress. So when we have the opportunity to do that, I think virtually every year, from what I understand, the Advisory Council does extend its support to Congress for improvements in the historic tax credit. That's something that, again, if you're listening out there, is an issue worth learning more about, and I think it's certainly a topic of great concern to preservationists. And just before I turn to Mr. Eckhouse, I wanted to also mention that you discussed, you mentioned the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. One of our 9 federal agency members is the Department of the Interior, and they have recognized, both in past internal reports as well as in a recent centennial report for the Park Service, recognize the need to modernize those standards. And in recognition of that, over the summer, I called for public comments on the Secretary's standards. And some here on this panel actually helped to submit comments, which were included in our review. And hopefully very soon, I'll be releasing my report as chair to the members of the Advisory Council. And I will say, as a preview to that, that many of the comments that we received relevant to this topic, housing, reflect exactly what Mr. Garcia has said, which is that sometimes the interpretations of the tax credit and interpretations of the standards, particularly in tax credit projects, have proven to be maybe stricter than what the rehabilitation concept requires. And working through that as a preservation community, recognizing and acknowledging that, and trying to figure out, well, what do we do next with that as we reflect on that? Is it new guidance? Is it adding to the standards? Is it really going back and stripping back to the rehabilitation standard? What maybe Congress and we originally meant when we talked about rehabilitation. So that's a work in progress, but I think you raised 2 very relevant issues that our agency is tackling right now. And so with that, I'm going to turn to Mr. Eckhouse. And you work for Yes in My Backyard Coalition, one of many around the country that are really focused on increasing housing supply and affordability. And I think one thing that we've heard from groups in that vein are, well, preservation is sometimes, including in California, used defensively. So communities. Actually, let me ask you how you see. What is the issue for defensive preservation as you see it, and do you feel it's problematic for housing production? And again, we're talking right now about some of the challenges that we might see on the ground.
Yeah, so I think we see 2 major ways in which historic preservation can be used defensively to block housing. One of them centers around SB 9, the state duplex law, and its treatment of historic districts. So SB 9 does not apply in historic districts. And we've seen some efforts from different neighborhood groups to get their neighborhoods designated as a historic district as a way of avoiding the terror of duplexes arriving there. And at times they've been pretty explicit about what they are trying to do here, that the goal here is to block that type of housing opportunity. There's a case in San Mateo that's going to be moving, I think, at the next State Historic Resources Commission meeting, the Baywood neighborhood, where some of the proponents of that have been pretty explicit It was sparked by an effort by a black homeowner there to add an extension to his house to accommodate his parents. This caused quite an uproar, and now they're saying, well, this can be a model for other neighborhoods that want to undermine SB 9. We saw this in Pasadena. The city attempted to very rapidly designate almost all of their single-family neighborhoods as landmark districts, and they got slapped down by the Attorney General for not going through the proper process there. But so this is one way in which we see. You can contrast that with how things have worked with ADUs, which are allowed in historic districts, and cities can regulate the design through objective standards. And I think we've not seen that same kind of issue. The other thing we see involves specific properties where development is proposed. And that's a whole spectrum. And it can range from, just the city requiring the developer to conduct a review for potential historic resources, which the challenge for the developer then is it's an additional cost, it's additional delay, and it's additional uncertainty. It can also deny them access to any of the categorical exemptions from CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. So that's further cost, uncertainty, and delay, and in particular, a greater risk of legal challenges. And then at sort of the extreme end of that, there are some preservation activists who will specifically file landmark applications on a property where a development has been proposed. There's a clique in Berkeley it's like a very small group of people that are pretty consistently doing this. There's been examples of this here in Los Angeles, Amoeba Records and Takes, the French restaurant, being some pretty prominent examples where there was an attempt to file a landmarking. That's not always successful, right? But it is, again, it's cost, delay, and uncertainty, and that can be a real challenge. Sometimes if you think about any development that was delayed from 2019 to 2020, entered an entirely different world for finance and construction and the rental market. And so who knows how many homes we lost through that type of delay. You can contrast here with SB 35, the state streamlined approval process for housing, which has a much more narrowly and clearly defined standard around historic resources. It can't be used for any project that includes the demolition of a historic resource on a state, federal, or local register. But it's a much more straightforward way to identify what those resources are.
Thank you. And just for folks who might not know, you use the term ADU. Could you define that? And how is that different from a duplex? Because an ADU is often thought of as 2 units on a lot. So maybe you could give us a little bit of nuance there.
Yeah, so ADU is an accessory dwelling unit. A lot of other ways they can be referred to: granny flats, casitas, in-law units. I think they're on a spectrum with duplexes in that they are both ways of adding an additional home. The ADU, notably, it is accessory to the principal dwelling, so often there are requirements that it be smaller. There may be limitations on conveying it separately from the main dwelling. 20% of the new homes built in California each year now are ADUs, and that's largely due to a really successful legislative effort at the state level to unlock that potential. Los Angeles has been a city that has seen a tremendous amount of ADU growth in that time period. I would say we've not seen the same level of success by any stretch from state efforts to legalize duplexes, but there are things that could be complementary to each other as well. You'd have both duplexes and ADUs on the same lot.
Thank you. And I think, the issues you raised, we have certainly seen in other places. As a preservationist, we want for those places that have value and are recognized in the community for their historic and cultural value to be the places that are designated and venerated. And so I think we as preservationists also have an interest in making sure that our tools are not used to do things beyond that. I did want to talk, so now we've heard a little bit about the challenges to housing conversion, housing creation, housing rehabs, and a little bit about the dynamics taking place here in California with some really great examples of specific local and state rules and how they work together. That said, we have a lot of very creative people around the table, and so now I want to move for really the rest of our time as a panel into some solutions. So first, I want to start at the local level, and I'm going to go to Mr. Phillips. So you've written a book on how cities can enact policies to become more affordable. What kinds of policies can cities enact at the local level if they care about both historic preservation and about housing?
Very good question. Or
read the book, right?
Yeah, why not? So I think the starting point for this, just to set a little bit of context here, is, if you want to produce housing, there are a lot of factors that need to be considered, of course, but the short version is that building housing needs to be legal, firstly, and then as straightforward and inexpensive as possible while still meeting health and safety standards. If the cost is so high that only very high income people can afford it, then there's not going to be much of a market for it, and very little is going to be built. Similarly, if compliant housing projects face meaningful risk of lawsuits, of political interference, of unexpected fees or exactions, and also in rarer cases, these third-party nominations to be historic monuments and similar kinds of tools, after they submit applications for redevelopment in particular, then their costs go way up, and suddenly a lot of projects are no longer feasible. And just to be very clear, if legal, straightforward, and inexpensive is the goal, California's approach to housing policy over the past 50 or more years has mostly been to make dense and affordable housing illegal where it could, and to make it as complex and expensive as possible to build where it couldn't. So as for how we produce more housing, taking into account historic preservation, or just building more housing generally, there's certainly no silver bullet. It's going to require a lot of complementary reforms. I think a lot of the reforms that we need to make to produce more housing of more types, though, and at lower cost, are entirely compatible with historic preservation. I think really one of the big synergies is just in allowing denser housing in more places. That helps lower per unit land costs, which is good for affordability, but it also means the development pressure is less concentrated in just a few neighborhoods, often neighborhoods where multifamily housing tends to already be legal in most cities, and those neighborhoods are often older, they're more centrally located, and that means they're also the places where we're most likely to find historic properties. So we're really, through our policy, creating excess pressure in those places because so many other neighborhoods are essentially off limits to building more and lower cost housing. I think reducing uncertainty and risk is key here, and there's absolutely no reason that should be in conflict with historic preservation. Removing a lot of discretion, moving a lot of the policy making and decision making about housing from individual projects up to a community planning level that has a lot more community engagement, a lot more buy-in, and not allowing individuals, neighbors, what have you, to essentially have veto power over projects that an entire community agreed they would support in their plans. And I also just think this is not really policy, but I think it is important to recognize that historic places in most cases are not lost or destroyed by allowing new things alongside them. That variation can be beautiful, it can be compelling, and it helps keep our living historic places from becoming dead museum pieces. So, historic places were once new places too, and I think we should be thinking not just about the preservation of these places we have, which is the focus of our conversation here and extremely important, but also how we're creating places that 100 years from now people will really want to continue to preserve as well.
Thank you for that. And in sticking with these comments about really the local strategies, I want to turn back to Mr. Bernstein. We've heard a little bit about the adaptive reuse ordinance, which I agree has been a model for other cities. Just again, starting here in LA, and going back to our policy statement, which identifies the role of zoning, and you mentioned the overlay zones that are used through zoning to deal with historic districts. You're continuing to try to tackle these issues So I just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about the new adaptive reuse part of the draft citywide housing incentive program, and anything else you might want to mention about the city's efforts in this regard.
Oh, thanks. Yes, so we are really trying to bring adaptive reuse into the 2020s, and of course the reasons for that have already been made clear in this discussion. We have the housing crisis on the one hand, we have a commercial vacancy rate crisis. We're working very differently than we once did post-COVID. We have a 26% commercial vacancy rate in our office market in Los Angeles, and the New York Times did a piece. That's the equivalent of 30 U.S. bank towers. That's our 73-story tower across from the library. 30 of those are sitting vacant in Los Angeles, so there's this tremendous opportunity to unlock a portion of that, we hope, for new housing. And the adaptive reuse ordinance was very successful. We developed more than 12,000 housing units in downtown alone, but we've never had a citywide approach to adaptive reuse in Los Angeles. It was still requiring a zoning administrator discretionary approval, public hearings, to do adaptive reuse, even in existing buildings, in most of the city, aside from some targeted incentive areas. So the citywide adaptive reuse program is meant to take adaptive reuse citywide, roll forward the eligibility dates. Previously, only pre-1974 buildings could qualify for the adaptive reuse incentives. We're proposing to take that by right process up to 15 years, and that would be a rolling date going forward, and then developing a number of new incentives, basically allowing you to kind of keep what you have and kind of bypass the zoning process for a building that's already built. And I think we feel that that is really an important approach to clearing away the zoning impediments. This was very successful with the original 1999 ordinance, and feel we could do this again. So that is one of 6 components of what you mentioned, the citywide housing incentive program, which will be unveiled shortly from our department. And adaptive reuse is one of the centerpieces of kind of meeting our housing needs in the city going forward. And we're very hopeful that that is a way of incentivizing both new housing and creating new incentives in the process as well for affordable units, which I think you'll see in the new draft we'll be unveiling shortly. I did just, because we're talking about locals, we'll just very quickly build on the comments about ADUs, because I think that's important as well. And clearly the state paved the way for that by making those ADU approvals by right, not needing to go through our planning and zoning processes in the same way. We're seeing those in our historic districts. Our HPOZs have, that is in many ways almost the preponderance of the applications we're seeing in many of our historic districts today. And we have approved nearly 500 ADU applications just in the last 2 years in our 35 HPOZs, our 35 local historic districts in LA. And that's pretty astounding. I don't think we could have imagined that a decade ago, that we would see that number of accessory dwelling units in historic districts, and the sky has not fallen. Most of those have been, compatible. I think, you can question some of them perhaps, but by and large, the historic districts, remain intact and remain, cohesive, architectural districts.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, too, that in a lot of places, especially in the historic homes that were built, and especially those in the larger lots, there were multiple residents for, perhaps
a lot of our
less
districts
relevant
were a
reasons
mix
today.
always of densities, and I think the Conservancy did a study a few years ago. Actually, our residential density in the HPOZs, this is Place Economics, Donovan Ripkema, who I know many of you have worked with, the residential density is 50% higher in our HPOZs than the residential density in the rest of the city combined. So, you do have this kind of livable, walkable density in many of our districts. It's not the stereotype that these are kind of high-end single family. There are a few of those, but by and large, you have a much greater mix, both in terms of density and socioeconomically in many of those districts.
Well, I want to keep on that theme of density and actually turn it back over to Mr. Scott Fine, and in your role in the LA Conservancy's strong leadership in a lot of preservation conversations. How are you viewing the density conversation? Our policy statement talks about density without demolition, and so it is that at least at the federal level, we're thinking of this additively. What does the LA Conservancy support in these areas, and kind of how are you framing it in preservation terms?
It's a good question. It's a hard question. this whole conversation, I often say it's complicated, and it's not a one-size-fits-all in terms of how we're looking at this. But we generally support density, and that is, as Kim was saying, that is part of the historic precedent of many of our historic neighborhoods. They have a range of densities. He was saying in terms of the density of our historic preservation overlay zones, it's I think almost 40% of the 35 HPOZs have 5 or more units provided. So it's not like there should be a conflict. I think that's what's often we're seeing is this kind of tug of war in terms of like the housing YIMBY community and the preservation community. And I actually think we have a lot more in common than we have in conflict. But it's figuring out how we get there. And sometimes the outcome doesn't match the intent or some of the legislation and policies that are in place. It doesn't quite look like what we would hope it would look like in terms of inaction in our neighborhoods. I think the other thing that we're having in this conversation and thinking about, which we really haven't touched on yet, is much of the conversation around housing is about building and production, and it should be. But the other side of that, another piece of that, is about how do we retain what we already have, the natural occurring affordable housing. How do we incentivize the reuse, the reinvestment in those properties, because that's our highest concentration of affordable housing right now, mainly in older and historic neighborhoods. But we're seeing some of those demolished, redeveloped, and residents displaced, and that's kind of the disruption that is also a challenge. So that's part of what we're looking at in terms of this issue, and also just thinking about how do we do and find that middle ground and that balance. And we do have some examples where it's either it's ADUs or it's specific projects. I can think of like Chase Knowles in Sherman Oaks. It's a large garden apartment development. Not everyone was happy. Rarely are everyone happy. Maybe that's when you hit the balance. But it added new housing units as part of the historic garden apartment units. So it found that bridge to add more density. And I think we need more examples like that to show how we can densify already existing dense historic neighborhoods, but do it in a way that doesn't harm them. And I think that's part of the approach, and also finding the balance between building and also reinvesting. I think it's kind of a zero-sum game if we don't put some parity in terms of what we already have and making sure we don't lose ground in terms of our existing affordable housing, because we honestly can't build at scale or affordable given the cost of new construction. So we need to find those balance between those two aspects to really have a comprehensive approach to looking at affordable housing and this confluence between housing and preservation.
Yeah, and so you raise a number of interesting follow-ups, and one thing that I think maybe you could speak to, or really anybody, that Mr. Phillips raised, is this question of certainty and risk, and reducing certainty and risk. And thinking about density is one aspect of things, but we haven't really dug into this question of the design standards, other than the brief discussion of the Secretary of the Interior standards. I actually don't know if LA adopted the Secretary of the Interior standards wholesale or not, but whether you did or not, cities around the country adopt either directly by reference these federal standards that I was discussing, or create their own standards. One thing that has been done by some communities and that I've heard advocated for is more design guidelines, more guidance on how new additions will be considered in historic places. Is this an idea that has legs in California? Is this an idea that you think would help to address several of these challenges? And if it is, what are the issues that policymakers at the local or even state level might have to consider in thinking about clearer design guidelines? I'll just throw it open to anybody. Yeah,
I
go
can
ahead.
start if it's helpful. So yes, this is a very current, pertinent topic, how we think about this transformation, how we do design review and design guidelines in California. As a result of some of the state legislation that's been referenced, there's been a real shift to requiring that local governments move away from the more kind of subjective types of design guidelines that we've typically had, and we do have in our preservation plans, like for our 35 HPOZs, where the intent was really to provide flexibility and allow multiple pathways to approval by a creative design team or an applicant. But there's a level of subjectivity or uncertainty in that process. And so the requirement from the state is that we now use objective standards that are fixed and quantifiable. By nature, that means they are more prescriptive to a degree, and there's less flexibility. That's the trade-off, perhaps, for the certainty. So I think we're all struggling with how do we create objective design standards that yield the types of preservation outcomes that we have wanted to yield through our more flexible, call them subjective design guidelines that we've had in the past. One of the things that we're doing in LA along those lines is building upon what was said earlier about SB 9 and some of the other state legislation, in addition to ADUs, that allow for subdivision of single-family lots, creating up to 4 units on a lot. We are, through our urban design studio, which I also help lead in addition to the Office of Historic Resources, we have a project we're calling the Low-Rise Design Lab that's building on a low-rise design challenge that was sponsored by our former mayor's office, Mayor Eric Garcetti's office, and his former chief design officer, Christopher Hawthorne, that was really looking at how we create successful designs of largely 2 to 4 unit housing, not only ADUs, but triplexes, fourplexes, and ways that we can create either new design standards or standard plans for applicants who want to go forward with such projects to ease the way in terms of what can get approved. And really, how do we build in the types of design approaches we want to incentivize? How do we incentivize applicants to preserve the existing historic or main residence and add on to that rather than demolishing and starting with a clean slate? How do we incentivize preservation of mature trees and the types of designs that really are reflective of the design traditions that define LA and Southern California, forms, prototypes like the bungalow court or some of the well-loved housing solutions that have not really been possible with current zoning requirements. So I think we're really trying to be more proactive and be thoughtful about how to build upon some of the state laws that we have, that they are a reality, but how do we yield the types of design outcomes in this new world where the kind of subjective design guidelines are not where it's going to be going forward.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add? Sure.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on this. So it's really exciting to hear about the City of LA's work in this. I am of the mindset of creating design standards is really important to continue building support for reforms in the future. I think we oftentimes struggle with the balance that you described of trying to facilitate the creation of new housing, but also trying to ensure that what is built does not cause a lot of uproar. So I think if you can create an environment where the standards are clear and objective from the start, you won't have as much of a pushback from the development community per se, because oftentimes building to those standards creates value to their project, assuming that they're good, high quality standards. And one city I like to point to that I think has done this really well is the city of Portland, Oregon, which has done a lot of work in thinking about how do you create design standards that would allow someone to build a bungalow court or to build a 4 or 5 unit building without restricting the actual size of the structure itself. So thinking about, creating standards where you disincentivize, let's say, a single-family home teardown in favor of the creation of a McMansion that's just really large, and actually try to push those projects to be 4 or 5 and 6 units instead. And so I think a lot of cities are struggling with this as well, but there are some, and I think the city of LA is probably one of them, that are trying to think proactively about this rather than just reactively.
I think something that comes up in a lot of this conversation is a concern that when you have objective design standards, you're kind of losing the architectural influence, creativity, and so forth. And I think there's some truth to that. I think it is a trade-off to some extent. But I think maybe one way to think about objective design standards and how we implement them is, this is the path you can take if you want to be certain and you want to move quickly. And if you follow these rules, then you're going to be approved. It's going to be you're going to be able to build soon, but still leaving the door open for people to come with creative ideas and have to go through a more complicated and time-consuming process, but leaving that door open. I think there's a compromise there, and also learning over time and adapting when someone comes in with a good idea and you ultimately end up approving that, incorporating that into the next round of reforms and making that part of what is now within the design standards and people can build by rights. So the next person doesn't have to go through that same process.
Yeah, I mean, the Portland example brings to mind just a plethora of form-based codes that have been started to be used around the country. And I was the chair of the City of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission for 7 years, and we are said to have the largest number of historic buildings per land mass or some figure on the National Register. We just have a huge number of historic districts. The city was founded in 1635, although none of the structures date back to that early period. But I mean, we did adopt a form-based code there, really looking at the patterns that the neighborhoods had created. And to your point about architectural creativity, it turns out that 100 years ago, people were also not so creative. They sort of built the same kind of thing, and now they have their different colors, different porch, articulations, slightly different windows, but more or less the same floor plan and the same pitched roofs and the same, configurations. And so, I think as an architect, of course, I value my creativity, or whatever. But I do think that, when we want to build housing quickly, when we want to deploy architects, developers, property owners to, and encourage them to do that, that certainty does add value.
If I can just add one small point.
Sure.
I think at the end of the day, everything is trade-offs, and we can maximize architectural creativity, or we can maximize affordability, or we can find some balance between the two. But I think, for me, certainly affordability is going to be the priority, given the trade-offs. Doesn't mean we don't consider those other things, but I think it's just recognizing that you really cannot have it all. You can't have 100% of everything. And so these conversations, the policy-making process, is about determining where those lines are drawn.
Oh, but I want it all. Mr. Scott Fine.
Good luck.
I was just going to say, as part of this conversation, I think we are at a specific moment in time where local communities throughout California are trying to catch up to the state legislation, because it's kind of a new operating system, and that is putting some pressures on tried and true methods of planning, whether it's design review or through historic districts or overlay zones or whatever it might be, that neighborhood groups and communities have relied upon, and now they're not so, in place, or there's questions about that. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about, well, what does that mean and what's coming, and being able to catch up to the legislation, because every legislative cycle, which we were just part of a bill, is being introduced that changes things, and then what does this mean, and how does that conflict, or how does it work in tandem with another piece of legislation? So that's why it's so complicated, because it's almost changing every year in terms of how we look at this. And the other piece around, form-based codes and other types of standards are often more focused on what you're building new, which is great, because and I think LA's done a really good job with Recode in terms of thinking about how new development will respond to the existing context, but that also is being delivered in a very slow fashion in terms of the community plan process. So it's this kind of such a rush. We want the housing, we need it now, we want planning, and all these things happening at the same time, and they're not always lined up as we would like them to be.
Your comment is a perfect segue to turn to our SHPO and move from the local level back up to the state level. And, again, you've heard the conversation, the back and forth, and I'd just love to hear, again, here for us in DC, we've talked about in our policy statement the need for flexible design reviews, the need to balance these competing concerns, issues related to environmental sustainability. And I just want to ask you, when it comes to housing and historic reviews and these other values that we've been talking about, how would you recommend, or how would you see us as preservationists balancing preservation with whether it's affordable housing, energy efficient housing, environmental hazard-free housing? I mean, any of these topics, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think we could spend the next 7 weeks talking about just that question. It's so complex, and I think at the same time it's not. In the federal reviews that we do, which is the bulk of the work we do at the SHPO's office in reviewing projects, there's a couple of different layers that happen. So the National Register of Historic Places nomination process happens first. That doesn't prevent anything from happening to a building or a property or a neighborhood. What it says is you have to think about it a little more. And then it sends it to the local level where all of the what you have to think about happens. And so I think that if we agree that historic preservation is a community value like clean air and clean water and affordable housing, we have to figure out how to work together. Every one of these issues is just like a spoke in the big wheel, right? We're not one over the other, but how do we look at these things? And a lot of the conversations, for example, about converting commercial real estate to housing and the vacancy rates in urban centers, developers tell us that won't pencil without incentives, and the state's looking at a giant deficit right now. So we have, I think, what can we do now? What's more long-term? Where are the things that we need to change long-term? And then how do all of those things lead us to where we need to be, which is safe, affordable housing for our communities, right? So I think there's a couple of things. The state has a historic building code that's probably unique to many places in the country where you can meet the requirements of building codes on a performance-based manner. That allows for things to stay historic and still meet the needs of communities. In fire hardening, we have a building that received historic tax credits in San Francisco that raised the structure a couple of feet because it's adjacent to the San Francisco Bay. There are different ways that we've seen adaptively reuse in buildings that have also met clean energy standards. So climate change, preservation needs to be part of all of those solutions if we're going to have not just existing communities, but help our communities to thrive. And I think that the flexibility is there in the programs and the processes that we have at the federal level, those that we administer in our office. I think it's really a couple things. How do we start talking to each other? How do we look at where those priorities are for those individual communities at the local level where it needs to be? And then what kind of incentives can we do to sort of look at those small, medium, and large solutions to get us where we need to be now? If we're looking at just incentives, it's going to be long overdue that we're going to have, this problem I think is going to get bigger before it gets smaller. And I think that another part of it that nobody thinks about or rarely thinks about are survey tools. The question about certainty and reviews. State and federal agencies have requirements to do surveys. I know that local governments are incentivized to do surveys as well. There's not enough funding for that. But how do we get those things in a place where all the information is known and available and people can use it in advance to make intelligent decisions about what's being built for their communities? And I'll just quickly say that one of the things that we're doing in our office with the State Historic Resources Inventory is we are right now creating a program that puts all of that information to a single system, and we're going to make it available online for the public and with the confidentiality that needs for things like archaeology and those things. But it's I think a collection of all those different tools that's going to take all of us working together to create these solutions. Having worked for a private developer on the other side of making historic preservation work, I've seen how it works, and I know it can happen. And the biggest, I think, commodity we have is each other and our intelligence to work together.
I love that comment, especially about just understanding what's out there, because and this is maybe it's relevant to housing, but it's really relevant to all federal projects. We do not have a comprehensive inventory of local, state, and national register places, just at a very basic level. We have some information about National Register designated sites online thanks to the Park Service, but they acknowledge it hasn't been updated regularly. We have some states that are very advanced, thank you on that, and of course LA maps its resources, but not every community in the country does that, and even if everybody did, there's not an integrated way for us to understand where these places are. So I should hold on the data question, or maybe if we have a time at the end, we'll get to it. But just to say, I will +1 that very specific comment, and and our agency is trying to do the best it can in trying to help promote those conversations in DC. So, with that, I want to turn back to you, Mr. Eckhouse, and maybe pivot a little bit from that, from the regulatory side, and talk maybe more philosophically about some of the ways that we might think about exemptions from state laws. So I know some of your California GIMBY colleagues have talked a little bit about well, should we make it, should we make it harder to designate districts? Should we limit the number of, the percentage of land a city can designate? Another friend of mine and I were talking about, well, maybe it's not the designation process, maybe it's that each city gets a budget of land, a percentage of their land to exempt, and they decide what percentage of land within each community they exempt from whatever statewide housing bill is. So I guess just turning to you and just asking you about, what are different, I mean, is that something that might be palatable? How are you thinking about that designation exemption conundrum as you see it, I think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of setting sort of a budget around what we preserve, how we preserve it, what limits we place, as Shane said, this trade-offs are unavoidable here, and so it's a way of formalizing, I think, that potential way anyway of formalizing those trade-offs and trying to make really clear and force us to ask ourselves seriously, what are we seeking to preserve, to what end are we seeking to preserve it, and how does that fit into the fact that our built environment is going to need to change to meet the needs of the present and the future. Something that I've been thinking about lately is an experience I had studying in Barcelona. I took a class on the Spanish Civil War where we visited one of the last remaining bomb shelters from that time period. Barcelona was one of the first cities in the world to face sustained aerial bombardment from the German Air Force during the Spanish Civil War. And we toured a bomb shelter. It was a very interesting experience. And they commented that this was one of, I believe, only 2 bomb shelters from that period. They had been widespread throughout the city, one of only 2 that remained. And we were curious, why were there so few left? Why had there been so little preservation of this aspect of the city's history? And they said, well, a lot of them were replaced during the construction of the city's metro system. And that was a really important priority for the city. It's a great system. It really helps getting around. And that came into conflict. I'm glad that they preserved some of those shelters. It was an experience that I think meaningfully enhanced my understanding of the city's history. And I also think it's worth really asking, if there were 10 or 12 of them left instead of 2, would that be a meaningful enhancement over having 1 or 2 available that are available to visit? And what is the trade-off that was worth? Would it have been worth preserving some of those shelters if that had come at the cost of building a widespread metro system that contributes so significantly to mobility of people in the city today? I think this is something that we're going to have to really think about in California. Adaptive reuse is great. I think there's been some tremendous success with that here in downtown LA. And also, we're going to have to identify ways for historic neighborhoods to grow and to change because, we have a real shortfall between the current built environment in the city and the state and the nation and what we need for an affordable and sustainable future.
Yeah, and I mean, I think my question was really, not thinking about a budget for historic properties, but thinking instead about a budget for exemptions. So in other words, the city might say, well, we'll, have X amount, and again, and this is, I think about a place like Hartford with so much of its land designated historic, and there are different ways to treat that local and national registered designation at the state level. So just putting that out there as and maybe an alternative to tackling the designation process itself, which again, many of you in the room who are aware of the federal process, the National Register has its own process, the state has its own process. So, thinking about, when I think about as a preservationist, interfering with the designation process, that to me feels a little bit different than thinking maybe coming at the question in a different way. So I'll just maybe put that plug out there. I do want to ask Mr. Phillips though. Again, going back to the theme of affordability, what can the state do? And really, I want you to focus in on an issue that I think has a lot of ramifications on affordability, but also on historic districts, many of which were destroyed by this one arcane little rule, which is minimum parking requirements. So cities that have imposed minimum parking requirements, high minimum parking requirements in particular, have seen historic main streets, the buildings torn down to create parking, where of course parking never existed there before. And I know California as a state has eliminated parking mandates. Is it for ADUs in historic districts, some areas around transit stations? And, I guess, from your perspective, is that a potential solution? Should we, here in California, maybe in other states, eliminate parking mandates in designated historic districts? What do you think?
Yes, we should do that everywhere. The reality is that even when you don't have parking requirements, parking gets built because most people want parking. And I think, Ken, you might agree that the fact that the adaptive reuse ordinance did not require parking as a condition of approval was maybe the most important part of that policy. I think the reality is that these parking spaces cost a lot, especially in structured underground or above ground. We're talking $30,000, $50,000, $80,000 per space. These are very significant costs. More parking encourages more driving, all else equal. And, I think especially for historic districts, a lot of these places were built when people didn't have cars. Of all places, I think requiring parking in historic districts probably makes less sense than just about anywhere else.
I agree, yes. Did you want to comment as well? Oh, that was a thumbs up. Okay. Excellent. Well, that's an area that maybe most or all of the panel agree with. And I did want to pitch it over now to Mr. Garcia and ask again, in your work as a researcher, which really is actually, again, a bigger picture question of what do you need as a researcher to understand these dynamics in the housing and preservation relationship? And what could you do as a researcher if you had relevant information?
Be careful. I'm going to go off on a list of a wish list that I have, but really it comes down to having more data and more information to understand the opportunities available to us when we talk about adaptive reuse and leveraging things like the historic tax credit and where it can be eligible and where it can be used. I'm really excited to hear that SHPO is doing a lot of this data work to put it together and put it out to the public. I think in preparation for this conversation, my team and I were digging through the SHPO site trying to see if we can pull some information, and so to hear that there's going to be a kind of a one-stop shop is, I think, awesome. And Chair Bronin, to your point, having a one-stop shop where we can quantify the amount of land or structures that are either within the boundaries of a historic district or the structures themselves are on the historic list would go a long ways to researchers such as the Turner Center to be able to really quantify the opportunity and potentially the challenge too. One other thing that I have seen out there that I would love to see more of is that there have been some proprietary attempts to identify which buildings are good candidates for adaptive reuse. So the engineering firm Gensler has done this for a few cities where they've looked at building floor plates and other specifications of buildings to identify where in a city are buildings really well positioned to be converted into residential. And so we all see the huge potential here with the number of offices that are vacant or underutilized, but it's not always clear which of those are actually good candidates for redevelopment. So to the extent that we're crafting policy that is trying to incentivize or catalyze adaptive reuse, it's important for us to know where that's actually going to happen. So having more of that geospatial data would be useful as well.
Great. So, we talked a little bit too about an integrated map, and that's one of my big aspirations, at least to get the ball rolling at the federal level. We do have other researchers here and other people interested in these inquiries, so I'll just throw it open to the rest of the panel before we move to our closing question. Anybody else have a data wish list that they would like to see develop?
I know we don't have a lot of time. I'll just endorse what David said.
I agree. I think you could really then look at these questions of what percentage of land in a city has these restrictions, how does that align with their housing considerations, do we see more or less housing opportunity in historic districts? Like, just having that basic knowledge of what is a historic resource and where is also something I think could actually be hugely valuable for the development community, right? San Diego is looking at designating properties as non-historic proactively, which I think is an interesting concept because it clears up this question of, do you have to do an assessment of potential historic resources here? No, this area we're not concerned about in that way.
I just wanted to put in a brief plug for those looking at data in the city of Los Angeles. Historic Places LA, historicplacesla.org is our one-stop shop, our comprehensive inventory for information on historic resources, both those that are designated and those who are identified through our citywide historic resources survey, Survey LA. So again, that's mappable, searchable, and it's meant to be that resource both for the development community and for community members to be able to look at data by theme, by geography, however you're seeking information. It's meant to be that baseline for really to guide good planning and good decisions by the private sector development community as well.
This is really starting to feel like a City of LA infomercial, isn't it? What do you not do well here? Yes.
Just on this issue of data, not to do more infomercial, but maybe. We asked this question at the Conservancy, I guess 4 years ago now, about the impact of preservation and what it was having on neighborhoods, but also this question like how much do we have and where's there room to grow? This question of where do we add density and how much is available? And it was helpful just going through that process. It was our Preservation Positive LA study. It gave us a quantifiable metric in terms of what's designated already, what was picked up by Survey LA, what's eligible. It's like 7% of the city. So, Don Brookman has looked at other cities, and it's often around the 10% or less. So most cities have a lot of room to grow, and it gets to the point that Shane made earlier is that 7% is located in a very concentrated area, and often the area where you want to have the mass transit and all the other kinds of developments. So that's where the rub happens in terms of that. But the fact that is we have a lot of space where there isn't anything historic, and we should see density and new growth and development. And then, Aaron, you mentioned what San Diego is looking at. Beverly Hills does a process where it says what's not historic. You have to go through a process, but it's the same kind of concept. So it's kind of the flip of sometimes what we look at, and also having the certainty and understanding what is or isn't historic.
Thank you.
I'll quickly jump in and say that there's just two things. One is that we've seen, who decides and who's at the table, right? So we've seen in efforts before to put freeways in modernized cities that those that historically have not been able to afford owning properties have been the most affected. And now their history is intangible. So there's not built environment for many of our communities, especially our immigrant communities. And so I think we just have to think about not repeating those mistakes when we're trying to figure out how to solve the many problems that we have in our communities to help them thrive. I also think that the locality sort of drives this conversation. And the question, Sarah, about if you were to dream about what you an overlay. When I was in Scotland at one point looking at the historic castle there in Edinburgh, and I was handed an iPad, and they had a relief map of the entire country, and I could fly this iPad over the relief map, and I could hone in on a place and see where there were natural resources that were important, where there were historic buildings, where there were some endangered species. I could see all the different layers of values that I wanted to see flying this iPad over this map. So how we take all the information that state and local governments have and put it in a place that we have that level of information to make good decisions at our fingertips is my dream.
Excellent. Okay, well, I want to just do a 30-second each lightning round for everybody, and I'll start with Mr. Garcia. Come around, and then I'll ask Member Ward to make just a closing comment or observation, and I'll do the same. So for our three on that side, Mr. Garcia, of the issues we've discussed, what is one policy that you think should be adopted immediately where we could, as preservationists and housing advocates, find common ground?
I think it's one of the policies that you're already exploring in your capacity as chair, which is to re-examine the tools that we have in the toolbox for preservation to see if we can recalibrate them to work better for adaptive reuse projects. So things like looking at modernizing the Secretary of the Interior standards, maybe looking at how the historic tax credit is implemented. It would, I think, go a long ways towards helping figure out this financing gap for projects that are just on the margins, that just need a little bit of that extra incentive to get over the finish line.
So that's two. You
Sorry,
snuck two in. Okay, are you going to do the same?
Yes, I am. I think it's incentives to fill the gap. I will go on that. I think it's also ensuring that we have thoughtful planning that can help guide us to get to the outcomes that we really want to see. And then the other piece to this, I think, is, again, putting people first. You know, this is ultimately about people, and how do we ensure that either people in existing places right now, apartments or whatever, are protected, as well as planning so that we can have good homes for everybody in terms of this conversation around preservation and housing.
Shippa Polanco.
I think making sure that our solutions are sort of short-term, medium-term, long-term. I think some of them are going to take longer to solve. Some things we need to solve now. Like if we wait to solve the bigger things, we're not going to really meet the needs that we have now. So having a comprehensive look at where we are, some things, and sort of figuring out how we can make those kind of small, medium, and large outcomes so that we can get to where we need to go together.
Mr. Bernstein.
Well, lots of things I could mention, but maybe I'll come back to adaptive reuse as my one possible priority, since we're working on that. And I think I would say that in finding common ground around adaptive reuse, bringing our own adaptive reuse ordinance into the 2020s, part of it is doing what we're doing and clearing away the zoning incentives, but coupling that with what many of you have referenced, the need to have meaningful financial incentives to go along with that, as other cities have done. And we also need to solve some of the building code, fire life safety challenges, structural issues here in California. We're beginning to work on that with our building department, fire officials, and others, kind of putting all those pieces together. I think it's going to take preservation community, the housing community, the development community more broadly, and partnerships within government to really bring all of that together.
Mr. Eckhouse.
So I think this is not something that is necessarily ready to go this moment, but very interested in more discussions around the concept of sort of an exclusion budget and how that fits with our current historic preservation process and how we might need to adapt around it. I think recognizing the concerns that Mr. Fine, Mr. Phillips raised around thinking about the significance of location in that process. But I think it's a very interesting idea that I would love to explore more with members of the preservation community.
And Mr. Phillips.
I think maybe the thing I'm most interested in is how we create a framework where when neighborhoods are designated historic, that is not the end of their evolution, where you can essentially build nothing except maybe an addition, an ADU, but really still allowing them to change in terms of the number and variety of families they can accommodate, allowing denser housing, but finding a way through design and other means to still make it feel like it belongs there.
Thank you. And I'll turn it over to you if you had any final observations as we both listened to these perspectives today.
Yeah, a couple of observations. The first is, first of all, I think for my lightning round, more of these kinds of roundtables. It's pretty cool to see different parts of our world in the same room together talking, and I think I'm amazed how much overlap and values that we all share, and I think that's really promising. So that makes me optimistic, and so I think the more that we can do that and be at the same table, I think we'll get to our goals a lot faster. And then just in closing, a couple of things. I think adaptive reuse has been really successful, and we've sort of seen since the initial phase of that in Los Angeles that it's hard to argue with the success. It's also clear right now the numbers don't pencil out, and so the 2.0 is needed, and I think that's always going to be a cycle, the ebb and flow of the economics of the reuse. But then that gets me to the sort of equity equitable distribution of space and land and how important that is, and that that all of our areas, all of our lots, all of our zones really need to share in the need for housing. And I think the thing that I'm optimistic about, and I've probably worked on a lot of those ADUs, but that 500 ADUs in the HPOZ overlay zones, I mean, I think that's pretty impressive. I mean, if you sort of look at all the numbers of the housing built in the state, I mean, for such a small area, that's pretty interesting and great. I love this discussion, though, about the ADU, and it just makes me think about one of the things that gets in our way a lot is fear, and the sort of fear of change. And I think the ADU is a good sort of storyline, because if you think about parking and parking in the garages in a city where the car is loved so much, I think probably a lot of us who have garages may not park our cars in the garage, and so that first fear of like, what's the garage being used for, is sort of removed, and so it took the ADU a while to evolve, and the ADU law, and it took a couple of revisions, as many years since the sort of initial pass, but it was worth waiting for. That we've got the 500. Again, I keep coming back to that number and the local number. And so I think that's where we're at. We're at this point where on this one extreme, we're at ADUs, which have been wildly successful. And then on this other extreme, we're on, talking about adaptive reuse 2.0, which maybe the economics just don't work out right now. So we've got to I think we're starting to overlap our values, and I think it's easier down here on this ADU side. We've got a little bit more land here. Getting back to the fear part, they haven't been that scary. We've lost a little oversight in the historic zones, but for the most part, it's been a success. And so I think if we can sort of learn from that and find those places that don't affect the historic streetscapes, which was the initial intention of our HPOZ zones, from an exterior perspective. And then also a comment in our notes today that we didn't talk about, I'll just bring up before I sign off, because I've already spoken too long, though, is the division of existing residential structures, single-family residential structures, in a way, because some of those interiors are not currently protected under our overlay zones. And so if we could split those to create more housing, so that some of that generous, green, beautiful, clean land could house more people, I think it would only help and be a better part of the solution. So with that, I'll sign out. Thanks.
Thank you. And again, thank you for your service on our board and our council as the chair of our Policy and Legislative Affairs Committee. Thank you to everybody who was here today. I hope you do continue to participate in these conversations. They're really important. They're important for preservation. They're important for the housing world, and really trying to find this common ground is a huge priority of mine, and one that I know many on our council, including Member Ward, share with a lot of passion. I also wanted to thank the Advisory Council staff in DC, as well as one here today, for everything that they did to help set this up and to make this possible. And again, thank you to our panelists, and I hope you'll join me in giving them a round of applause for their time and expertise today in what I hope is one of many conversations to come. Thank you, everyone.